Good crowd, good turnout. My name is Hunter Haskins. I'm the secretary of the Martinsville-Henry County Board of Directors. I'm the newly selected, chosen assistant director for the Salem Museum in Salem, Virginia. And it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce you to our Sunday afternoon lecture speaker, Mr. Ron Stowe. Ron Stowe is a native of Stanleytown and a 1973 graduate of J.D. Bassett High School. After high school, Ron attended Virginia Commonwealth University, then graduated from Danville Community College with a degree in police science. And it should be noted that he graduated from DCC on a Saturday morning and then began working as a deputy sheriff for Henry County Sheriff's Department that very night. After 5 years with the Henry County Sheriff's Office, he moved to High Point, North Carolina to work for that police department, where he retired as a captain 27 years later. During his time at High Point, he obtained a BS degree in social science from Gardner-Webb University and graduated from both the Administrative Officers Management Program at NC State University and the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. After retirement from High Point Police Department, he served as Public Safety Director for Guilford College in Greensboro for an additional 8 years. Ron is married to the former Debbie Harold, a Bassett girl and 75 graduate of Bassett High School, and they live together in High Point, North Carolina. He's an active member of Green Street Baptist Church in High Point and is chairman of the Board of Directors for Crime Stoppers of High Point. Please give a welcome to Mr. Ron Stowe.
Well, thank you very much. I told Hunter earlier, it's amazing how good you sound when you can write your own introduction. Thank y'all for coming. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the Historical Center in having me and having this. I think it's important. This has been near and dear to me for a while now, and we'll talk a little more about some of the reasoning for that. So thanks again, and I see several folks here who were also at Bassett Historical Center earlier in the week, so you're gluttons for punishment, but just know that I'll give you a rebate on your admission fee.
Yes.
So for about 3/4 of the 20th century, Henry County, specifically the communities of Bassett, Fieldale, and Stanleytown, benefited from a unique form of law enforcement by the way of what was called special police departments, and they were actually appointed as special police officers. So my plan today is to give you an overview of those departments, some of the men that worked with them or worked for those departments, and I won't be talking about everybody that worked at all of those departments, but I will mention some of them. If you're interested in all of the men that work for them, you need to buy the book, which happens to be on sale here today, and I'll have them after the presentation. But I tried really hard to chronicle everybody that ever worked for any of these agencies in the book, but time just doesn't permit everyone being mentioned today. So in addition to talking about the special police departments we had here in Henry County, I want to give you a little background about special police in general, because while special police weren't unique to Henry County, the way we used them, the way they were connected to the industries in the area, I think was unique. So the concept of special officers wasn't necessarily unique, but the way we benefited from them here with the town and the industry and the police being together, I think was kind of unique. So here's an article from the Roanoke Times in January 1974 that pretty much sums up the uniqueness of the special police. A lot of the slides that I'll show you today, You probably will have difficulty seeing and reading, and I apologize for that. But many of them are 100 years old. The original document is 100 years old from court documents. Okay. This particular article was in one of the former special officer's personal scrapbook, and it was under the laminate, sticky, adhesive stuff. And had I tried to take it out to get a good picture, then I would have ruined the article and the scrapbook. So that's why this one is kind of fuzzy. Point being, this article again was from 1974, which at the time, there was some controversy boiling about the special officers and the support for them, and we'll talk a little more about that as we go along. But so this article was pertaining particularly to that. And again, the headline, Henry Law Enforcement has a unique structure. And then it starts off as saying, law enforcement in Henry County is structured in an unusual, if not a unique manner. And I think that pretty much sums it up, how unique they were, and we're going to talk some more about what made them so unique. Before we get too deep into our program for today, I know we have several of the guys that were special officers in Henry County that are here. I really appreciate them being here. Best I can determine, there's about 15 that are still living that were ever special officers. I know we have several here today, and I appreciate their support and their help. I've managed to talk to everybody that I know of that was ever an officer, ever a special officer, except one. And that wasn't for lack of trying, but I have tried that. But anyway, I would like for those guys, if you would, if you're here and you were a special officer during these times, if you would stand and let us know who you are, where you worked. HD, go for it.
I'm HD Lucas. I was a Stanley County police officer from 1976 to 1980. After the police department closed, because we stopped all the crime in Stanley. I went to work for the sheriff's office in the state, total of 35 years, and I retired in 2009.
I worked at Fieldale when Uncle Sam came out with what they call the seed program, where they funded everything and put extra person on. And I was there for a short period of time, and then went to work for the sheriff's department. And stayed there until married one of the dispatchers.
My name is Jackie Carter. I went to work for the Bassett Police Department, 1974. I worked there for 6 years. I left Bassett and went to the Henry County Sheriff's Department in 1980. I worked another 35 years in law enforcement and retired in 2015.
My name is Jerry Parkville. I served at Bassett Police Department for 2 years. I left there and went to Fieldale, served out of Seagull for 2 years over there. Then I left there and went to wastewater treatment plant. Stayed 14 years there. And I retired.
I'm Larry Dickerson. I was part-time with Bassett police officer for
guys will appreciate it. After we're done today, two things. One, I'll have some books that are available, but I also have a lot of memorabilia. A lot of it these guys have brought in today, along with some family members. Doug Stigall has brought in some things. So we're going to clear out some of this stuff out of the way, and please come up and take a look at this stuff when we're done. So a little bit about why I got into doing this research. I grew up in Stanleytown, as you heard earlier, and was son of Melvin Stowe, who was a longtime chief of police and officer there. About the beginning or the early part of 2023, it occurred to me that it had been around 40 years since we had police departments in this area, the special police departments. And it bothered me that soon there wouldn't be anybody around that remembered. And I didn't want that to happen. So I took it upon myself to try to do a little something to keep the memory alive and keep the memories of these men in the department alive. And when I began researching, I couldn't find much information at all. And I could find a newspaper article here, a picture here. You'll see on the table up here we have some calendars back in the 70s or so. The departments often did calendars with the officer's picture on them. I could find one of them, but there's no information that I could find centrally located about the special police officers or the departments. So I wanted to find out more. And in the beginning, my plan was that I would just talk to a couple of people, write up an article or something, and put it in the historical center. Well, it didn't take long until I figured out that this was going to be way more than that. So a year and a half later, we have the book that, I'm not sure that I mentioned, it just happens to be available for sale here today. But there was way more to what I was finding. The more I found, the more I wanted to learn, the more I learned. It was like a vicious cycle. So found out a lot of things. You know, I grew up around the special police officers and my dad, and you know, I thought I knew a lot about them, but it turns out I didn't. So I learned a lot in doing my research and compiling this information. It occurred to me too that there was a lot of people in Henry County that live here now that had no idea there was ever police departments in Bassett, Fieldale, and Stanleytown. And to me, that was a shame. I didn't want that to happen. So, again, the result is that we're here today, and I hope that, you know, what I am able to do will kind of keep the memory alive a little bit. Just a few things to keep in mind as we go through this presentation, and if you read the book. Again, we're talking about things that occurred 100 years ago in many instances. And we're going to get into when the first special police officer was appointed and kind of the history from there. But that information is a little sketchy at times. If you've ever done any historical research, I know Andy's back there, I know he's done way more than I did, but it's kind of sketchy. Sometimes the names are misspelled, sometimes they're wrong, sometimes they're left out altogether. So I've tried my hardest to include everybody. Could be that I missed something, could be that I got something wrong. Earlier I referred to the special police officers being men. You will hear me do that quite often. I'm not being sexist. I'm not being insensitive. It's a fact. They were all men. Again, we're talking about people that were police officers from 1922 till 1980, 1990s. So there were no women that were special police officers. And I want to throw out too that my goal, my focus, again, was just the special police officers in these 3 towns. Okay. Certainly there were law enforcement in the county, even in those areas before the special police officers. Okay. But they were few and far between. The county had constables that were appointed and elected. There were few of them. I think there was 1 for each district in the county. Their duties were way different than what we learned to expect from the special police officers. So there was law enforcement before the special police. There just wasn't much of it, wasn't many. And even with the Sheriff's Department, and as late as 1950, with the Sheriff's Department, there were 4 deputies for the entire county. So that kind of is why the industries wisely saw the need to have their police departments for their towns. Okay. So special police, again, is not a unique concept in Henry County. They began showing up, the term special police started showing up around the mid-1800s all over the country. How it started, why it started, I can't tell you. I don't know. I just found newspaper articles that from here and there. Often special police officers in those days, the term was used interchangeably with night watchmen, auxiliary officers, any number of things. A lot of times these special police officers will be appointed for a particular event. We saw a lot of them being appointed around election time. You can speculate just like I do, mid-1800s, why they would want to appoint special police around election times. But it would be pure speculation on my part, so we're not going to do that. But then in 1860, the General Assembly of Virginia enacted a law that said that the counties, if they deemed it necessary, could appoint a special police force. So fast forward about, math's not my primary language, about 60 years, and Henry County appointed its first special police officer. And it's interesting in that this special police officer that was appointed was not affiliated with any of the departments that we know of. And this is a copy, and again, like I said, this is from the actual court record in the clerk's office. So it's over 100 years old now. And it's not real good quality. And I'm not a digital genius when it comes to duplicating things. But this court order, it says, the court deeming it advisable to appoint a special police force for the portion of the county not embracing an incorporated town, it is ordered that H.P. Whisenant be and is hereby appointed special policeman for Henry County. And then that's, after that is just some legal jargon with the statute and stuff. I was able to locate H.P. Whisenant's grandson and great-granddaughter, who were totally surprised that H.P. was ever a special police officer. They had no clue, had no idea why. Again, I mentioned that sometimes the records were a little inconsistent. Most of the time, the records for appointment for a special police officer, the officers had to list their place of employment. So I found, I think there were 3 years that Mr. Whisenant was appointed. In the first 2, there wasn't any record of employment at all. The third one was he worked for Martinsville Cotton Company, or Martinsville Cotton Mill. So my guess is that the mill had him appointed as a special officer just to work nights around the plant or something. But that's, again, pure speculation. His family knew nothing about it. And the great-granddaughter even told me that she had done a lot of genealogical research, and it's the first she had heard of it. So we don't know much about him, except he was the first special police officer appointed in Henry County. So fast forward about 6 months, and in July of 2023, this court order shows up, is ordered that George S. Frame is hereby appointed special county police for the village of Bassett and vicinity. And again, that was, in January of 23. So about 6 months later, after that in Regional 1, this was the beginning of the Bassett Police Force. We're going to talk more, sadly, about Officer Frame as we go through. But he was the first for Bassett. That was the first special officer in those communities that we know of. So around this time, we were seeing industries spring up in the area. Furniture industries, textile industries, and the industries in Bassett, Fieldale, and Stanleytown saw the need for police protection for their communities. As you know, in addition to the mills and the factories, they built towns for their workers and stores and churches. What we know of today is these communities. So they started appointing their police officers to protect their towns. So what makes the special police departments different? We talked, with the very first slide, we talked about, even the Roanoke Times talked about the uniqueness of them. So the special officers were employees of the industry in the area. They had absolutely no connection to any government agency. They were hired by, paid by, managed by, reported to the industries, which became a point of contention as we go forward a few years. They had countywide jurisdiction. I mentioned earlier that there were few deputies and constables, particularly in the early days. They had countywide jurisdiction, and often these officers, although their primary responsibilities was to their individual communities, they often were assisting the sheriff's department in other areas of the county. You know, I did a lot of research in old newspaper articles, and a lot of times the only mention I found of an officer was where it could be a Bassett officer that was involved in something in Ridgeway with one of the sheriff's deputies. So they were often helping with those things, although their primary responsibility was to the communities. Most of their salaries, all of their benefits were paid by the county, by the industry. County did supplement their salaries some, but even that is hard to track, hard to pinpoint exactly how much or when that started. I do know that in November 1946, the county board of supervisors voted to give the special officers a raise in the supplement that they were receiving. Some of the special officers remember that about 1/3 of their salary came from the county. Others I talked to didn't think it was quite that much. But we do know that in 1958, Tom Stanley Jr., who was vice president of Stanley Furniture at the time, approached the board of supervisors asking for a raise for the 2 officers at Stanleytown, a raise in the supplement that the county was given. And Mr. Stanley at the time was quoted as saying, these officers work from 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. for less money than a common laborer. The Board of Supervisors rejected his request for that raise based partly on their statement that they didn't know where the extra money would come from. And what he was asking for was a total of $150 a month. So, again, we're talking about 1958, but it's hard to imagine that the county couldn't come up with $150 a month. And that was a total, not per officer, by the way. So by 1972, the state adopted a law that set a minimum salary for all law enforcement officers in the state. And that minimum salary was $7,200 a year. Some of us remember starting to work for the Sheriff's Department here about that time, making that. But that was a point of contention because the state says any police officer in the state's got to make at least this. That apparently required a raise from most of the special police officers at the time. And there was some concern or some consideration about who was going to pay the extra. Because again, most of them were going to require a raise. So from what I was able to find out, they reached some agreement. But this is about the time that the county started really looking at trying to do away with the special police the best they could. But keep in mind that the county, aside from the supplement that they were paying the special officers, had no control over them. So at this time there was a lot of dissension, a lot of talk among the Board of Supervisors about this. And Roscoe Reynolds, who was the Commonwealth Attorney at the time, and also the legal advisor to the County Board of Supervisors, was quoted in a newspaper article about that time and about this issue as saying, it should be understood that the special officers are not accountable to the county. And the county cannot demand anything from the police over which it has no supervision. So on the same topic, but if we fast forward to around 1995, the General Assembly, by this point, the special police, and as we know it, and what we're talking about, were pretty much gone. But the General Assembly instructed the State Crime Commission to study the special police officers in the state. And one of the findings in this study kind of verifies what we're saying here. And they found that if there's no chief of police in the county, it's not known whom the special policeman reports to. So you can see why that might create some issues for some people, particularly people who want to control things. Right? But again, they worked for and reported to the industries. They provided their own equipment for the most part. excuse me, what their companies or industries didn't buy for them, they had to buy themselves, including cars. And we, in addition to me, we've got a few folks here whose parents, grandparents were special police officers. And we can remember riding to church or to the grocery store or go see relatives, whoever, and having the police radio on in the car. It wasn't totally unusual to get involved in something because they considered themselves always on duty too. So I found it quite interesting that in the late 1949, there was some discussion among the Board of Supervisors about buying cars for law enforcement in the county. And apparently at that time, even the deputy sheriffs didn't have cars. So the Board of Supervisors voted, after a lot of discussion, in January of 1950, they voted to not buy cars, but instead buy radios and put in the officers' cars. So there's a couple of things about that. That's my mother-in-law, by the way.
That's not you on the phone.
It's a wrong number.
That's for sure.
So she had told me to say something funny today. So
That was funny, don't say that there.
So, a couple of things about them agreeing to buy radios for the cars that I find interesting. Number one is that they hadn't had any radios or any form of communication before. And the second was that they approved the purchase of the radios. And in doing so, they approved buying radios for all law enforcement in the county. That included Sheriff Morton Prillman, his 4 deputies, 2 special police officers at Fieldale, and 5 at Bassett, and a game warden. So that's 13 radios they bought at a total tune of $6,600. Some of y'all probably got cell phones in your pocket right now that cost that much. Bought 13 radios for $6,000. Which, again, I find that those 2 things very interesting about that. Was one, they hadn't had the radios before. So heaven only knows how they were communicating. They probably weren't. And that there were so few officers in the county. But again, keep in mind there were 5 officers at Bassett alone and only 4 deputy sheriffs for the entire county. So finally, let's jump into the departments. Again, there were 3. Before we do, let me point out that, again, there weren't a ton of people that ever worked for these departments. But there were 3 men, O.T. McCray at Bassett, J.A. Stigall at Fieldale, and then Melvin Stowe, my dad, at Stanford. These 3 are probably the best known in their communities as being associated with the police departments throughout history. And these 3 men had a combined 129 years service to the communities. McCray worked for 43 years, Mr. Stigall for 57, and we're going to talk a little bit more about him. And then my dad was a rookie, 29 years. So again, 129 years service by these three men alone. Chief McCray retiring. This is Rex Voss, who succeeded him as chief. Excuse me. So I mentioned earlier that George Frame was the first officer appointed at Bassett. He was appointed in January 1923, roughly 6 months after the court started or signed the order to start the special police in the county. Sadly, Frame was killed like 2 months later. Apparently he had really made a name for himself early on and was shot and killed in the area called New Bassett. And from what I can gather, that's what we now know as North Bassett. The next officer that we know of in Bassett was R.D. Giles. And again, I'm not going to go through a chronological list of these, but R.D. Giles was appointed in January 24, and by January of 25, he was the deputy sheriff. So he wasn't at Bassett very long. I wasn't able to find anything else for anybody being at Bassett PD until Chief McCray was appointed in 1927. Again, he served for 43 years, and one news article that talked about his retirement stated that in addition to being chief of police, he was the head lumber buyer for Bassett Furniture. Bassett PD was typically a little different than the other two departments in that they were branded as Bassett PD. The other two were typically just branded as Henry County Police. And Bassett was typically the largest of the others, at one time having as many as 9 officers and a dedicated dispatcher. Again, here's a patch that Bassett wore most of the time. In later years, they developed another patch, and Jackie and I think Doug, there's a couple of them up here, the newer ones. But for the most part, this is what Bassett PD patch looked like. And their badges also said Bassett Police. This was a building that was typically their police department. If you've ever been through Bassett, you probably saw this and just didn't realize what it was. This is a recent picture. It still sits there in the parking lot of Bassett Furniture main office. And it's part of, Andy, help me out, the power plant? Power plant for the Industries now. Maybe hard to see from where you're sitting, but right there you can barely see where it says, it used to say headquarters. They've added this vent and there was a door right there and not here. You'll see in the picture in a few minutes where it said police headquarters there by the door. But that's the building that was typically was used by the police department. Here's a group photo from, best I can date, it was 1970 to 1973. Jerry Atkins isn't here today, so I can't pick on him, but that's, oops, sorry. That's Jerry right there. I've got Rex Voss, Jimmy Wigginton, Jerry Atkins, Herman Ferguson, Ben Smith, Norman Jacobson, Ronnie Hatcher. And again, that's 70 to 73, best I can date that picture. Here's another picture, and here's the first time of the police headquarters before they repurposed the building. Got St. Conway, Jackie, Ben Smith, Frank Baum, Eugene Smith, George Woods, and David Ross. And this picture, best I can tell, sometime in the late 70s, 1978 to 1980. Fieldale PD was smaller, much smaller typically. Mr. Stigall took care of business in Fieldale. He didn't need 9 people. And I mentioned that Fieldale and Stanleytown typically were branded as Henry County Police. Again, all 3 departments had county-wide jurisdiction. So Stanleytown and Fieldale chose to identify as that instead of their specific location. First known officer in Fieldale was J.W. Slaughter. He was originally a constable, but then was appointed in 1924 as a special police officer. And J.A. Stigall, Mr. Stigall, again, who's best known, was appointed in 1934, and he served until his 85th birthday in 1990. And there was one news article reporting about his death that said he was the oldest working oldest working police chief in Virginia and one of the oldest in the nation. I would suspect he was both of those at 85, but that'd be hard to verify, I think. So there's a picture of Mr. Stigall doing what Mr. Stigall did. If I had to guess, I'd say that's probably at a school crossing. And then this is a later picture of him and Charlie Bradshaw, who was one of the officers there for a few years. And then the last of the 3 departments was Stanleytown. I have heard a man by the name of J.L. Baker being referred to as the first officer in Stanleytown. He was actually, from what I can gather, a constable and not a special police officer. So he was there in the early 1920s in the area. The first appointed special police officer was Kane Edward, or C.E. Conway. Now, he worked in Stanleytown from 1927 to 1951 as the only officer there for those years. And then in 1951, excuse me, Melvin Stowe came as the officer and stayed there until the department closed in 1980. I think it interesting, and again, it's one of those things I didn't know till I did this research. In the history of the Stanleytown Police Department, there were less than 10 men that ever served. I think there were 8 if my math is correct. But less than 10 men ever. And keep in mind, Bassett at one time had 9 at one time. So again, these departments were small. They were kind of specialty, unique for their communities. So I talked earlier about the Sheriff's Department not having very many officers. Well, as we're getting into the 70s, the Sheriff's Department's growing in size. They have cars now, and they're more able to take care of all the county. That, along with the change in business climates, the controversy by the Board of Supervisors and by the state law mandating a minimum salary of those factors, I think, played into the beginning and the end for the special police departments. Stanleytown PD was the first to close. They shut down in June 1980 with 3 officers. We back up just a little bit. There's the police department from Stanleytown. That building is no longer there. It was right across the street from the furniture factory, Stanley. The police department was in this corner. This building had served a lot of functions. There was a doctor's office in there. There's a post office here. At one time, there was a general store, company store. When the doctor's office was in here, the police department was down the block there a ways. There were apartments upstairs, and things changed. The post office moved, the doctor went out, and the police department moved up here. There's the first car that was ever bought for Stanleytown PD. Memory serves me, it's 1974. And one thing I like to point out about this car, or about this picture, is notice the tag on the front. That's the same tag that you have on your cars. Because again, they were not a government agency. They were not county. And they were solely industry sponsored, paid for, no affiliation. So their cars ran regular tags just like yours. And there's the 3 officers that were at Stanleytown when they closed: HD, who's here today, Melvin Stowe, and Norman Jacobs. So again, Stanleytown closed down in June of 1980, with these 3 guys being the last ones there. By the mid-70s, Bassett had started reducing their size. They had been again as many as 9. They had slowly reduced their size, and by the fall of 1984, they reduced their size to 4 officers. Then they went to 2 officers, and those 2, Ben Smith and Randy Harris, remained until they finally closed the department in May of 1987. Fieldale was the last holdout, and they had only 1 officer from 1991 till 1999, and that officer was David Disher. So at the end of 1999, the special police departments as we know them in Henry County, no fanfare, closed. Just gone. Just like that, we got 3/4 of a century of law enforcement that just ceased to exist. And that again is why I wanted to preserve their history. A couple of interesting things that I ran across again in doing my research is there were several family names that seemed to keep popping up. Let me point out that there were a lot of other connections, a lot of other law enforcement connections between special officers and people who went on to have law enforcement careers. But these I'm going to talk about now are just people who were multiple family members who were special police officers. So the first one is, the first name that comes up a lot is Conway. We talked about C.E. Conway being the first officer in Stanleytown from 1927 to 1951. And he had 2 sons that became Bassett officers. One named Waller, or everybody referred to him as Jack, He was an officer in the late 50s and early 60s. And then St. Conway was his other son that became an officer, and he was there from 1964 to 1982 at Bassett. Now, there's all kind of puns you could make with people named Lawless being in police work. But the Lawless name was very common in Bassett. First one was Will Lawless, who was one of the ones, if you remember seeing the picture and the one that's on the book, it just happens to be on sale today, by the way. The picture at the beginning of the four guys with the big guns standing in front of the car, Will Lawless was one of those. He was at Bassett in the early 40s and mid 40s, early 50s. He had a son named Mo, or we called him Mo. His name was David. He worked with Bassett, Stanley Town, and with the Henry County Sheriff's Department. Had a lengthy career from 1971 to 1999. Now, David likely got a double dose of police and gene as Rex Voss, who was another Bassett officer and one-time chief, was his uncle. And there were other Lawlesses at Fieldale, and best I could determine, there's no relation between Will and David. And then Ralph and Ray were identical twin brothers who both served at Fieldale for a time. Another name that came up was Nichols. Paul Dean Nichols Sr. worked at Bassett and Fieldale PDs, and then retired as a magistrate for the Commonwealth of Virginia. He had a son named Nicky. We refer to him as Nick, as many of us do. He graduated, and I think he goes by Nick now. His actual name was Junior. He was a Fieldale PD from 1977 to 1980, and he too went with the Henry County Sheriff's Department, where he worked for 13 years. Nick has a son named Brad, who is currently a detective with Cornelius, North Carolina Police Department. So that makes the Nichols a three-generation law enforcement family and connected to the special police. And then again, we can't talk about special police without talking about the Stiggles, which several of them are here today, by the way. Thank y'all for coming. One of the early Fieldale officers was Jesse Ben. He was originally a constable for the area, but was appointed as a special police officer in 1925. And then his brother, J.A., who was there for 85 years. So I thought that was interesting that so many people were connected to the special police and through those families. So having grown up basically in law enforcement, been around it all my life, there's a soft spot in my heart for officers who were killed on duty. And I would hope that it would be for all of us. Okay? So I couldn't let an opportunity go by without talking about, there were 3 officers with ties to our special police departments who were killed on duty. Okay. First was, again, George Shelton Frame. He served from January to March 1923. He was shot in North Bassett or New Bassett. Frame was originally from Baltimore, Maryland. Was working for Newport News, Virginia Police Department when he met a girl from Henry County who was there, what newspapers refer to doing war work. They were married in 1916, moved to Henry County in 1917. He went to work for Bassett Furniture, and then again was appointed a police officer and was shot and killed just a couple of months later. They knew who did it, a guy by the name of John Stone. There was a $1,250 reward issued for apprehension of Stone. And again, keep in mind, we're talking 1923. That's about $23,000 in today's money. $1,000 of that was put up by Bassett Furniture. The other $250 was put up by the county. So his killer, John Stone, was arrested just a couple of days later in Floyd or near Floyd, and he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. There's a couple of interesting things I've alluded to, the media at the time and how things were reported. You know, we think it's crazy now. You need to go back and look at some stuff from the early 1900s. But I wanted to read a couple of things about this case to you that comes directly from the news at the time. And again, there's more details in the book. The description of the murder scene I'm sorry, I had it marked in the book that I don't have up here. But the big thing was, here we go, I'm sorry. The report stated that John Stone, a young white man from West Virginia, employee of Bassett Furniture, shot Frame in an unprovoked attack, and that people of Bassett were justly indignant and aroused by the unprovoked murder of a faithful official and good citizen, and otherwise leaving nothing undone to bring about the apprehension of the murderer. And then it's kind of disturbing to me that at the trial for Stone, again, it only took him just 2 or 3 months to bring him to trial. I guess speedy trial meant something back in those days. But Judge Clement declared the defendant guilty of first-degree murder, but stated that, as in his opinion, Stone, a young man, was in some measure the victim of a prevailing sentiment which encouraged antagonism to and defiance of officers in the discharge of their duties. And because of that, he would not inflict the death penalty, but fix his punishment at 30 years in the penitentiary. It's kind of disturbing that those thoughts were around even 1923, but it is what it is. Second officer with special police ties that was killed on duty was John Jefferson Johnston. He was killed in a car crash on 220, somewhere here near Martinsville. He served with Field LPD from July 1941 till January 1945. I might add that Johnston had a son, a young son at the time, who later became Henry County Board of Supervisors member, and a grandson that would retire from the Henry County Sheriff's Department. served a career with the Sheriff's Department. He was a lifetime Henry County resident who died serving his community. And then lastly, we have Herman Ferguson, who served at Bassett and Fieldale PDs and had left and went with Henry County Sheriff's Department when he was killed in March 1975 while assisting a motorist. He had served since 1963. He too was a lifelong Henry County resident, and the guy that hit him left the scene. He was charged with drunk driving. He came back a couple hours later, was charged with drunk driving, manslaughter, hit and run. He was convicted and served 13 months in jail and a $500 fine. And I might point out that Herman's daughter and son-in-law are here today. Just thank y'all for coming again, darling. Here's pictures of Johnson and Herman. Right, to wrap things up, let me just say again that I grew up in Stanleytown. Hung around the police department a lot with my dad and the other officers that would come in and out. Very much of a Mayberry situation, even the red hair. I had a lot of interaction with these special police officers. And I grew to admire and appreciate them for everything that they did and were doing for their communities. And then as I started my own career, I was able to have some of those guys as my mentors and my trainers, and so I owe a lot to them in shaping my life in policing too. So I trust that my research and my doing this will keep their memories alive, and their memory will live on. And I appreciate again you coming. I'll be happy, Holly, if you got time, I'll be happy to take some questions. Good, if anybody has any.
What led to the closing of the police departments? Was it budgetary or liability or?
I think it was a combination of all of those. Business climate had changed a lot. As you know, by the 70s and getting into the 80s, those industries were really scaling down. The Board of Supervisors was having some issues funding their supplement, and they wanted everything to be under the control of the county. There was some, there was one quote, and it's in the book, that does quote liability issues by someone from Bassett. They quoted, or they talked about liability issues. So I think it's a combination of all those things. And the Sheriff's Department, again, being able to cover the areas. Yes, sir. Jim.
You said at one time Bassett had 9 officers. Were they all special officers, or did any of those include conservative and peace?
Those 9 were all special officers.
Roger, did you do anything on the Collinsville Police Department? Did you get any information on them?
I did. I got a little bit. I opted not to include it because it's really a different animal. Paul's comment or question is there was a police department in Collinsville for about 2 years.
2 to 3.
2 or 3 years. And it was a totally different animal than these special police departments. So, yeah, it was short-lived, and I did get some information, but I didn't include it in it.
I was asked, he said, how they were funded, we think they were funded by the county.
They were. They were. that's part of the craziness of it. They were all county, but it was separate from the sheriff's department.
I think I was a young guy back then, I think they, everybody else too.
Yeah.
I think they was flirting around at one time, because I grew up in Collinsville, about Collinsville was just mentioned and maybe becoming a little town of its own. That went through about 3 to 4 years, and it sort of went and came, and I think that was Sam Gussie was on board supervisors, and Grady Jessup from Jessup Furniture, they were all pretty integral people in Collinsville. I think that's how it sort of came, but it didn't,
I think
it
that,
left like it came.
I think that was all related. Anything else? Yes, Joe?
You know, one thing I want to say about my dad, Alfred Stigall. In 1934, J. Frank Wilson, he was the manager of Marshall Fields and Company, told him he wanted him to watch the town for 2 weeks till they could find somebody. 57 years later, Dad was still waiting. And he did other things to make money too. A lot of people didn't know. You know, I think Mayberry was like Fieldale, not Fieldale like Mayberry, because I was with Dad one day, and he pulled up at a bootlegger's house and told Ralph Lawless, he said, just go to the back door and he'll come right to you. So Ralph got at the back door, Dad pulled the siren, Arthur looked out the front door and rolled out the back door with the liquor. He carried him to jail. And, but he did a lot of things that people didn't know. You know, just like Andy Griffin, he could play a flat top guitar. Daddy could too. And he recorded for RCA Victor. And you can still find his records on eBay. Kelly Harrell and the Virginia String Band. And you can find them records. And if you hear him, he was amazing on the guitar. And he'd do all the jobs. He worked at Martinsville Speedway. And the main gate for Clay Earls for years, but a lot of people didn't know he worked at the Fieldale Speedway. A lot of people didn't know we had a racetrack in Fieldale. And his job there was to keep the people from sneaking in under and stopping the fights. And what they do, they go up there and they take the headlights up, and Glenn Woods would race there. That's where Glenn Woods got his start in Fieldale racing at the Fieldale Speedway, and I got a ticket up there in the showcase. It says Fieldale Speedway, event 1. So it's a lot of history. And
Doug, thank you. Let me see if we got any more questions, and maybe Holly can get you back on a day by yourself. How's that?
I'm always looking for days by myself with Doug's too. We have a good time together.
Was it true in the 1990 that the night watch, that they made him stop, hang around the donut shop?
No, that's never been true.
That was true?
No.
Okay, I didn't.
Slap him. Anything else? All right, thank y'all very much again for coming. I appreciate the interest. I've got books. I've got things up here I'd love for you to take a look at if you would, and if we got time, and I'll be here. Anybody wants a book? Thank you.
And thank you, Ron, very much for giving a program with us. And we're so excited to have your books. His books have been for sale at our bookshop, but of course they're here right now and you can get one autographed. Quick question, I'm Holly Gazelski. I'm the director of the Historical Society. How many of you read or know about the daily history column on our website it tells what's happened here locally 100, 75, 50, and 25 years ago? Anybody recognize that? Read it? Who remembers that column in the Martinsville Bulletin? That ran in the bulletin on page 82 on the side of the page, right until I left the bulletin to come here. So I do go through newspapers from the past 100 years, and every single day, including holidays and weekends, we have that column, which is on our website, mhchistoricalsociety.org. And to make it easy for people, I run the column on Facebook. So you can go to our Facebook page and click on it. We also have some interesting snippets from that column in our current newsletter and in the newsletters I have done. I pull out a few of them, but you know, it takes a lot of space. It's only 2 pages, but you can do a lot of reading on the website. And I mentioned that right now, and if you do not have this yet, please pick one up. They're on the front desk downstairs, and I have them right here. I'd like you to take one with you. It's good reading, a lot of history articles in there. So I wanted to mention that because there was the question about how did the police forces come to an end, and that is addressed in the newspapers in 1974, and they are in the column, and you can search this column for information. And so when that question came up, I searched special police, and we have 3 entries. But basically, and I remembered reading this in the paper, in February 1974, in that time period, some of the officers of the special police were saying that the bigwigs at the plants were deciding who they could arrest and who they had to let go with no comment. And it was a real big ethical dilemma for them. They were not allowed to charge the supervisors, but they were, they were not allowed to charge certain plant workers, and so they felt that they could not uphold justice when they were working on behalf of the factories. And they actually made some accusations. They left, they brought it before the Board of Supervisors, and that seems to have brought about the end of that. But we do have that in we have 4 entries in our history column that address that. And there are a lot more articles on that in the Martinsville Bulletin from 1974, 1975. And if you are interested in any topic, I can help you look up topics. Of course, Bassett Historical Center is the place, as we all know, for genealogical research. And if you would like local news and local happenings, well, I'm a former newspaper editor, and that's a big part of the way I approach history, is looking through the different news sources. So thank you all for coming. You've heard me say before, we are about to get a very exciting expansion with the annex. Well, now really the work is on. I mean, the building is built, and I'll give tours through it today if you'd like to see it, but we are at the very exciting point now, which is we're putting stuff in the building. And we're putting cases, we're in all sorts of configurations of cases, and then we're going to actually move items into it. We're going to design displays. And this is by the Historical Society. You are all a part of that. If you do not have your membership renewed, please renew now. Your membership dollars are a great help to getting that done. If you have any interest in helping construct these cases, build these cases, if you have a strong grandson to send our way, because this is getting exciting. And then the creative and artistic part is coming. And this is for everybody. We're all involved in setting it up, and we'd like to have you part of it. So thank you all for coming. I'll go downstairs with tours, and if you have not received a newsletter by mail, don't leave here until you get one.